Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to get started. My name is Kirsty Jacobs, and I've been hosting our CIPD Coronavirus series of webinars. This afternoon, we are addressing an incredibly important topic, but one that is sometimes not that easy to talk about: employers' role in offering compassionate bereavement support. With the UK recently reaching the grim milestone of 100,000 COVID-related deaths, it's highly likely that members of your workforce will have been affected in some way by the virus. They'll be experiencing bereavement, grief, and loss. Employer compassion and support is so vital. Joining me this afternoon to discuss this topic and to take your questions, a panel of experts. I'm joined by Claire McCartney. Claire is Senior Policy Advisor for Resourcing and Inclusion at the CIPD. Joined also by Kirsty Hunt, External Training and Consultancy Manager at Cruse Bereavement Care. And last but not least, Lucy Hurd, Bereavement Rights Campaigner and Certified Grief Recovery Specialist. Thank you all for joining us today. As ever, let me just run through the housekeeping quickly. This session is being recorded. You will be able to access it afterwards. The slides will also be available to download. You'll be able to find them on the CIPD website. To submit your questions, please do. Can I ask you to use the Q&A tab, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A tab to ask any questions that you want to put to the panel, but use the chat function if you want to make any kind of general comments or to connect and share with each other. It's always really great to see people connecting on here. If you are using the chat function and you want to talk to the other attendees, then you need to set it to all panelists and attendees, otherwise it will just be seen by the panel. Remember that the CIPD Coronavirus Hub is there as a resource, and that we're adding things to it all the time. And remember that for legal advice, CIPD members can call our HR Inform helpline, which is available 24/7, and using that gets you an individual response. And also, I want to flag, and it's really, really pertinent given the topic this afternoon, our wellbeing helpline for our members in the UK and Ireland. Working with we're now providing CIPD members with free help and support via sessions with qualified therapists, which you can access either online or over the phone. Health Assured have also launched a new app, which CIPD members are able to access. It's called the My Healthy Advantage app, and it provides an enhanced set of wellbeing tools, which are designed to improve your mental and physical health. And you can access that anytime and anywhere. Details about all of these offers are on your screen now. If you do need to talk to somebody, please do remember that this resource is available for you and it is free. So, on to the topic. Talking about death at all can be challenging for people, and doing so in the workplace even more so. But the impact of the pandemic, where employees may have lost family members, friends or co-workers, means employers must step up in supporting bereaved colleagues. Bereavement is also shocking, but the context, with people just unable to grieve together, means the implication for mental health might be even greater. Research from the CIPD has found that just over half of employees said they were aware of their employer having a policy or support in place for employees experiencing bereavement. We all experience bereavement and grief in different ways. In this session, Claire, Kirsty and Lucy are going to explore how employers and HR can best and most compassionately support their workforces at this challenging time. We're going to hear from Claire first, and then Kirsty, and then Lucy, and then we'll have time for questions. But please do put your questions in any time they come into your head, but we will pick them up after the presentations. So that's it from me for now. I'm going to hand over to Claire to get us started. Thanks, Claire.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Katie, and good afternoon, everyone. We know that in non-COVID times, at any time, 1 in 10 employees are likely to be affected by a bereavement. And as Katie says, our research shows that almost half of employees say that they're not actually aware of their employer having a policy or support in place for employees experiencing bereavement. So I think this underlines the need for greater employer action and support in this area. And we also would like greater support from the government as well. We're going to be talking a little bit about that as well. So at the CIPD, we've produced compassionate bereavement guidance for organisations and also for line managers to help support employees, often at one of the most difficult times of their lives. So I'm going to take you through our practical guidance and things that you can do to properly support your employees and your colleagues. But if we just move on to the next slide, just a little bit of context. So, and Katie's touched upon this, but it's not always easy to talk about death and bereavement. It's something that we don't discuss enough in society, and certainly not in the workplace. And quite often people think that this should be dealt with privately. But actually, death is an inevitable part, a normal part of life, and it's something which all of us have to face at some point in our lives. So if we can have open and honest conversations about death and bereavement, the better prepared and placed we will be to deal with this. So just moving on, I'm going to just say a little bit about the impact of the pandemic. Sadly, we know, as Katie said as well, over 100,000 people have died as a result of the pandemic, and employees will have lost family members, partners, friends, and even co-workers, and much of this loss will be unexpected and shocking. Many people will have been unable to have final conversations with loved ones before death, either in hospitals or care homes, or indeed at funerals, because we know attendance has been severely restricted. And depending on when the bereavement has happened, grieving employees might also be having to deal with a number of COVID-19 related issues in their lives, such as being furloughed, being made redundant, or indeed having to work long hours because they're on the front line and doing essential work. And all of this could exacerbate employees' grief symptoms, which may heighten the need for psychological and emotional support, such as counselling and therapy, to help them to come to terms with what they've been experiencing. And it's also worth emphasising that there have been a lot of non-COVID-19 deaths that have happened because of the crisis, and these are likely to have been equally traumatic. So no matter the cause, it's vital that employers work to provide employees with the support that they need, both in the short but also quite often in the longer term as well. So if we move on, we know that most organisations provide 3 to 5 days paid leave for bereaved employees, but there are a lot of organisations that don't provide paid leave, and there are very few legal provisions in this area. So Jack's Law, the legal right to paid bereavement leave for working parents who lose a child under the age of 18, was introduced in April of last year, after many years of campaigning and hard work by Lucy Hurd, who we are delighted that we have on the webinar with us today, and a number of other charities and organisations. And aside from Jack's Law, there's no legal requirement for employers to pay employees who take leave following the death of a close family member. So at the CIPD, in partnership with Lucy Hurd and with other organisations such as Cruse Bereavement, we've been calling on the government to introduce the right to bereavement leave and pay to all employees experiencing a close family bereavement. We know that bereavement can have a significant impact on a person and their work, and it's vital that employees are supported with appropriate time off at what is already an extremely difficult time. We know that bereaved employees are highly unlikely to be able to perform well at work if they're forced to return too quickly. So if we move on, I'd like to now draw upon our employer and our line manager compassionate bereavement support guidance to talk about the ways in which organisations can effectively support bereaved employees. And I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of the expert organisations who fed into this for us, including Lucy Hurd, including Cruse Bereavement, ACAS Mind, and many more. So let's move on to take a look at some of the things organisations can do around compassionate bereavement support in the workplace. So first of all, it's really helpful to develop a bereavement policy, which outlines your organisation's approach to bereavement support. And a policy could include, amongst other things, your reporting of bereavement, your policies around bereavement leave and pay, and also return to work options and linking to supportive services and resources. Your policy should provide support for and guidance for employees who have been bereaved, and also for the death of an employee. And it's important to involve, where relevant, trade unions or staff representatives in developing a bereavement policy, because often they're likely to have some really good ideas about what support is likely to be most helpful and how this can be communicated to employees. It's also important that that policy is communicated widely and linked to broader sources of support, such as line manager education. So the second area I wanted to highlight is around building open, supportive cultures. So really important to train your line managers to have open and sensitive conversations and to explore what extra support would be helpful to affected employees. It's important to understand that grief isn't linear. It doesn't have predicted stages, and I'm sure we're going to be hearing more about that. And employees will react differently to their experiences of bereavement. It's also important to say that different cultures respond to death in significantly different ways. So line managers should check whether the employee's religion or their culture requires them to observe any particular practices or make special arrangements. The third area is around acknowledging the bereavement, and this is so important. The individual that's been bereaved may or may not want to talk about the situation in detail, but acknowledging that it's happened is really, really important. It's also important to ask an employee how they'd like to stay in contact with you and maintain regular but not intrusive contact with them while they're away from work. And really important also to discuss with them what they would like communicated. By law, an employee has the right to keep their bereavement private from their work colleagues. So it's really important to ask your employees what, if anything, they'd like their work colleagues to know about the bereavement and who they would like to communicate that. Flexibility is key, and each person will experience bereavement in different ways and will need potentially different responses and support from their organisation. So it's important that to ensure that people managers speak supportively to their bereaved team members to discuss when they feel they'll be able to return to work and whether they'd prefer to come back to working their usual hours or potentially a phased return, and also to talk potentially about flexible working as well. It might also be helpful to discuss whether a temporary change of duties might be needed. I think it's also important to say that managers should be open to flexible working beyond that initial return to work phase, and that they should also be sensitive to requests for time off, especially around anniversaries or other special events. And then the final area I wanted to flag was around signposting to supportive services, organisations and charities, and we're really delighted to be joined by two such organisations on this webinar today. Some larger organisations may well have access to counselling, occupational health, employee assistance programmes, and if they do, they should highlight these to those experiencing bereavement. But they should also signpost to relevant organisations and charities that can support bereaved employees, and these will be particularly important for smaller organisations with perhaps more limited resources. And we have a full list of organisations that can help you in relation to bereavement included in our guidance, so please do take a look at that if you find that helpful. So I'm just going to go on now to say a little bit about what to do when a member of staff dies. So we know that experiencing the death of a staff member or co-worker can be distressing and can affect other employees in the workplace in general. So you need to make sure that you're supporting your workforce, but also other employees and the workplace in general. You need to support your workforce, and you also need to find out, confirm with the next of kin when and the extent of the details that may be shared with the wider team. And ACAS provides some really helpful guidance around this, which we've drawn upon from our employer and our line manager guidance. So I would encourage you to take a look at the ACAS guidance as well. So some of the things to do in terms of practical steps. So let people at work know that the person has died in an empathetic way. Offer support to those that have been affected by the death. Offer condolences to the person's family or next of kin. Share with staff how they can give their condolences as well. And provide details of the funeral or ceremony if staff have been invited to that. In terms of offering support, talk to staff about how you can provide ongoing support to those that have been affected by the death. Encourage line managers to have regular catch-ups with those affected to see how they're coping and whether they need any further support. Also, I think it's important to say, make sure that line managers themselves are also offered support if they've been affected by the bereavement. And if employees do need further support, as we said, do point to your organisation's health and wellbeing services and resources. Excuse me, just take some water. So do point to your organisation's wellbeing services if you offer them, and to external organisations of support. It might be appropriate to honour the person who has died. For example, you might consider creating a book of condolence for staff to share their memories of the person who's died, commissioning a memorial. You might want to hold an event to honour the person who's died, inviting the family or next of kin if it's appropriate. You also might want to organise a fundraising event, perhaps in support of a particular charity associated with the person that has died. And if there is media interest in the death, this could be incredibly distressing for the person bereaved, so it's important to acknowledge and support them. You might also need to identify a spokesperson, if applicable, prepare a statement and plan how confidentiality will be dealt with. And then in terms of finalising an employee's affairs, HR or senior managers should contact the family or next of kin of the person who has died to answer any questions they may have in a sensitive and empathetic manner about their pay, their pension, other benefits such as life insurance, and also returning any personal belongings. And family members or next of kin may wish to pick up any of their belongings in person, or they may prefer that these are sent to them. But it's really important to say, whatever the preference, make sure that the way that you return personal belongings shows true care for the deceased and their family and the next of kin. So you should also take any necessary steps concerning data relating to the deceased, such as removing information such as email addresses, details on databases and circulation lists, and informing key contacts about the death as well. So I'm just going to move on by flagging a really important event that's coming up, which is a National Day of Reflection on the 23rd of March, which is being led by Marie Curie, and it's certainly something that the CIPD are supporting. So if we move on to look a bit more at the detail of this gives an opportunity to come together as a nation to show support for everyone who's been bereaved and to celebrate the lives of all those who died. And Marie Curie will be holding online talks and conversations, and also giving advice on how you can support your colleagues who've been bereaved. So I think this would be a really helpful thing to support in order to get those conversations happening around death and bereavement. So do support this if you're able to. And I'm just going to finally finish off by sharing some of the excellent organisations, services, charities available out there for you to get support from in terms of bereavement. And as I said, there's a fuller list in our practical guidance, so do take a look at that and make use of that if that's helpful to you. So I'm going to hand back over to Katie now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. And just to note, those slides will be available, and I think they're hyperlinked, so you'll be able to click on all of those resources and it will take you directly there. Just a note to say that if you do want to ask a question, could you put it in the Q&A rather than the chat? I can see some people putting it in the chat and it just tends to get a little bit lost. So if you can put it in the Q&A, that means we'll definitely come to it. I'd like to hand over to Kirsty now, who's going to talk in a little bit more detail about bereavement and the workplace. Over to you, Kirsty.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to talk. I do apologise, my lights are flickering, so if you do see that in the background, it's at my end. Picking up very much on a lot of what Claire has said, but also introducing myself. I look after our external training and consultancy work at Cruse. I suspect quite a lot of people have probably not heard of Cruse before. It's not a surprise. But I'm going to give you a little bit of background of who we are and then talk about some of the things that line very nicely with what Claire was just mentioning. Next slide, please. Thank you. Cruse Bereavement Care, we were established over 60 years ago as a charity, originally in South West London, but now across most of the UK, but not Scotland. I'll come to that in a second. We, as a charity, offer support, advice, and information to anybody who has been bereaved. We're there to support people when somebody has died. All our support is free. We are a registered charity in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. We have a sister charity in Scotland, so if anybody here is north of the border, Cruse Bereavement Care Scotland do a fantastic job up in that part of the country in a very similar way. All of our support is delivered by trained volunteers. They are fantastically trained. They are an amazing amount of people who deal with some of the most tricky conversations, some of the most difficult and traumatic situations. And as you can see at the last point, we are currently supporting families impacted by the Manchester Arena bombing, at the inquest that's going on there. And we were heavily involved at Grenfell Tower. But we will support people from any cause of death. So we support people who have had bereavement from cancer, heart attacks, but of course, a lot of support for people tragically bereaved from the coronavirus pandemic. So what else do I need to say? How do we do that? I'll come to that very quickly. At the moment, we've transitioned all of our services to telephone, as you can imagine, and the best way in is via our helpline, and the number is later on, and it's certainly very available on our website. That's where people will have an initial call, and if needed, be supported and passed on for one-to-one support through a match with a volunteer. There's a lot. Not everybody needs that though, and it's really important to give the right support for the right people at the right time and in the right way. So whether that is in one-to-one sessions, on the phone, or in groups, or via web chat, we're trying to work hard to make sure that support is available in the way that people want to access it. But what I do want to say is a little bit about grief and loss and bereavement. Thank you. Next slide. So here's a few truths, and there's a lot of myths, and as Claire said, it's something people don't talk about as a society. So we really understand, we want to make sure that if you take one thing away from today, is that everybody's experience of grief is different. You may have heard people talk about stages of grief and the grief curve, and as HR people, I'm sure you're very familiar with Kubler-Ross and the change curve. We feel at Cruse that that's not the best model for grief. We feel grief is much more like that picture of the scribble. We want it to go nice and neatly from A to B, but the reality of it is it's a complete swirl, a mix, a muddle, a mess, and that's the emotional response, because that's what grief is. It's the emotional response to a death. It's really important to make sure that everybody understands it's not an illness, it's not a disorder, it's not a mental health condition. It is the flip side of having had a deep relationship with somebody. It's the flip side to grief, we quite often say within Cruse. But in itself, it's a natural process. It is a natural part of loving somebody and a natural response to somebody dying. What I really want to make sure, and what we're seeing quite a lot, is there isn't a hierarchy to grief. No one death, no one bereavement is any better, worse, more deserving than any others. And I think this is really important to say at the moment with the pandemic. And it's utterly heartbreaking for every family who've lost somebody. But alongside that, we've also had the deaths, all the normal deaths, the other deaths that happened, as well as the other ones that were touched on as well, the ones that happened because people weren't able to get treatment. But we have had all the more usual deaths running alongside it. So actually, those people are bereaved and haven't had funerals as well. And we think we did some working out that about 6 million people haven't been able to attend a funeral and say goodbye in the course of these last few months in the way around. And those will be people who've been impacted by COVID, but it will also be people who cancer, heart attacks, other progressive illnesses, and they are all equally deserving of support. They're equally deserving cases, and they're all equally tragic for every single family. there's also no time frame to grief. People will deal with these things in different ways. It will ebb, it will flow. At Cruse, in the early stages of the pandemic, we had quite a few people contacting us because the talk of death and dying and how it was all in the news actually had triggered historic bereavements back from 20, 30 years ago that they thought they dealt with, and it was bubbling things up, or they hadn't dealt with. This can absolutely, you know, this is what grief is like. It will flow, and some people might think they're all right and something will bub up and trigger. And it's being able to respond and support at that time that is really important and valuable. But we all grieve differently. Some people will grieve really loudly and be really vocal and really emotional. And that's their style. Other people may be much more internal and be much more personal about it. That's fine. There is no right or wrong way to grieve. How you grieve is how you grieve. And that will be linked to so many factors. It will also be linked to concurrent stresses. What else is going on in your life? So we see that quite a lot, that maybe people have multiple bereavements, and it's that cumulative effect of multiple bereavements that means that one is just all of a sudden too much to bear. We see there's so many patterns, and it's the whole thing about just don't assume, and that everything is, whatever everybody feels is equally valid and very normal. Can I have the next slide, please? Here's just some of the impacts. These are things we hear people talk about a lot on our helpline. And as you'll see, when you look at the slide, quite a lot of these are going to have an impact on how people will perform in the workplace. Some might be short term, others might be for longer. So certainly in the early days, people will feel numb and shocked. They could well feel angry, definitely feel helpless. But depending on the cause of death, there could be guilt, if only I had, or fear for themselves and anxiety. And I think a lot of those will be very easy to understand why somebody might feel those things. But people are often very surprised about the physical stuff that goes along with grief. There can be real physical impacts on people: lack of energy, sleep, tightness, all of those things. People actually can ache, stomach issues, all sorts of things that can be all tied up, linked to a bereavement. And those, of course, are going to have an impact depending on how long they last. Processing this information, lack of concentration. I mean, some of us are feeling this anyway from the whole consequence of isolation and lockdown and things like that, but these are very, very, very commonly reported by people following a bereavement. And certainly that's going to impact on how you perform in the workplace. People might not be won't be firing on all cylinders, for want of a better phrase. And in looking at the behaviours, if you're sleeping badly, of course that's going to have an impact. If you're not eating well, if you're not, all of these things can impact on how you can do your job in the day. So can we have the next slide, please? I thought it might be helpful to share the sort of things we hear all the time in our phone calls and face-to-face. Again, as an employer, thinking about how you might be able to respond to these if your staff member or colleague said this to you as a line manager, or even as an HR role, or just as a colleague. It's very common to this whole, I feel like I'm going mad, I can't eat, I can't sleep. These are all really normal things. And I think if there's one thing as employers, or just as people in general, you can do, is trying to make people understand they are not going mad. This is grief. This is normal. This is understandable. This is a factor of the fact they've lost somebody very, very close to them. It's about trying to reassure them that this is what it's like. Then help them take steps to support, to move onwards with what comes next in their lives. But normalizing grief is a big part of what we within Cruse are trying to do, and trying to get these conversations started with the wider community and society as large. And as you can see, all these comments go for any age, any stage, any type of person. So thinking about how you might say and support some of these people. I'm just going to sort of echo a little bit of what Claire said. If I can have the next slide, please. Just a few top tips to take away. As Claire said earlier, don't ignore the death, acknowledge it, offer your condolences, be human about it. Make sure, she said, that everybody knows what support's available. Great. We touched on diversity, religious beliefs, etc., etc. Yeah, know your workforce, know your mix. If you need to go and find out about the rights in Muslim faith or Hindu or whatever, probably a good idea to do that and be ready. Certainly the contact point was picked up by Claire. Now returning to work, of course, depending on who has died, this could be an enormous bombshell within the family. Somebody might have to take on sole parenting responsibilities. Somebody might be having to care for an older relative all of a sudden. That needs to be factored in. That needs to be factored into the support and the returning to work, and somebody being able, any adjustments that might be made to deal with that. One thing that often doesn't get thought of is considering the other members in the team. If you're the line manager or the HR person and somebody's going to take significant time off, how might that impact on those staff members who are covering or holding the fort or whatever, however you put it? Also, they might have known the person that died. If somebody's partner died, they may be socially, linked to the person that's died. So don't dismiss that. And of course, if it's a member of your own team that has died, of course, that's got, again, wider ripples. And a really easy one is to make a note in your diary, if you're the manager, of some of those special dates. The anniversary of the death, any birthdays, and depending on how the person died, there may be key dates around coroners and inquests and things like that. Be aware, have them on your radar. That's when the person might need a little bit of a check-in or touching base, perhaps even plan to take leave around certain key dates. Have a conversation with them and just factor them in. Yeah, and for some people, especially now, especially as we're in such strange times, some people might just get on with getting on, and that the impact of the bereavement may not happen until, especially at the moment, life returns to some semblance of what we were used to. Just have that one in the back of your mind, that something might be all right now doesn't mean to say when things change again that something may bubble up and have an impact. Sorry about my lights. Can I have the final slide, please? Cruse. So just so you know how you can access our support, so it's free, it's non-faith. Best way in is to talk to somebody on our helpline, which the number is there. But I would also say there's an awful lot of information on our website, and sometimes reading some stuff could just be really, really what people need in that moment. And of course, it's there at any time, day or night. Hope, again, is our dedicated charity for children and young people. We now have Cruse Chat, which is web chat. Again, some people find that really the better way for them to access support. And we can offer one-to-one support, group support as well. Currently, obviously, all on the phone or possibly on Zoom. And we also do a lot of training work. That's my part of the organisation. We have we've always done it. We've always done external training to any organisation who wanted to know more. And we go into a lot more depth than I have done here. We've moved that all to webinars, and we've delivered, I think, 550 webinars since the 1st of April to a massive range of organisations, public sector, private sector, NHS, charities, etc. We want to get the message out there to help you get better at supporting your people. So whether that's your managers, one area we have trained is mental health first aiders. Interestingly, I saw a question flick up to give them some skills as well to be part of these conversations. So that's all from me for now.
Thank you for that, Kirsty. That's great. I can see some comments in the chat that people have used the services personally and found them incredibly useful. There's some great questions coming in, including a few about mental health first aiders, and we'll come to those after we've heard from Lucy. So Lucy, over to you.
Thank you, Kirsty and Claire. So I'm Lucy Hurd, and I am a bereavement rights campaigner. As Claire mentioned earlier on, I was the person that started out campaigning for Jack's Law. It was never about calling it Jack's Law at that point. It was just I wanted to create better bereavement support within the workplace. I went through my own experiences of discovering there was no law to support people who had experienced a bereavement, and I felt that was an unjust, hence my 10 years of campaigning to try and make employees better protected within the workplace. Can I have the next slide, please? So, as I said, bereavement in the workplace, a few parts of what I want to talk to you about, a little bit more about the campaigning support and becoming a grief first aider. Could I have the next slide, please? So, as I said, campaigning for Jack's Law, it was parental bereavement leave came into power last year in April. And that is for parents who have had a child or baby die under the age of 18. This does include stillbirth, and there's 2 weeks paid leave to be taken within the 52 weeks. I strongly believe that all bereavement should be included into Jack's Law, hence why I've been working with the CIPD to try and get Jack's Law amended to include all family bereavement. And I hope that would include immediate family members to take time off to grieve a loved one. I don't think 3 days is enough time to grieve a loved one. A few things that Kirsty was saying within Cruse, grief isn't linear, it comes and goes. You have inquests, you have all the other practical administrative things that you might need to sort out, and you can't do that in 3 days. Funerals can take up to 10 days to organise, so 3 days is not sufficient enough at all. And then hopefully also offering the 2 weeks paid leave. So that's the ultimate goal, really, is to include and amend Jack's Law to include all family bereavement, so that anybody that is being bereaved in the workplace can take some time off to grieve a loved one. Could I have the next slide, please? So, a bereaved employee / that could be a colleague, I suppose, ensuring quite a lot of these things have been covered by everybody, but I will just put my penny's worth in. Ensuring a back to work plan is in place. I think that's very important to have that in place, be proactive rather than reactive, ensure that something's there to help your employee come back into the workplace. And yes, so whether you have discussed this beforehand with HR, or whether this is something that you discuss with the employee that's worked, so at the same time they have to be coinciding with each other. Signpost support, really important. Someone coming back to work might not necessarily know where to go, hence having a bereavement policy in place is of the utmost importance. So again, like I said, being proactive rather than reactive, having someone walk through the doors of the office and not knowing what to do can give mixed emotions, mixed messages to that person that has been bereaved. And so having something in place beforehand is probably the most important thing to have done. I devised something called a Just a Moment card. This is primarily for employees to have, if you're sat in a meeting, there's nothing worse than having to ask to leave a room. Whereas if you could just put down a card on your desk, you're not having to explain the reason that you're actually having a breakdown because you're missing your loved one so much. Questions can be hard when people look at you all the time. So putting a little sort of a tool on your desk, because you just need to take a moment and not having to explain to the whole of the team and all your colleagues that you've become overwhelmed with the sadness of grief. Remembering birthdays and anniversaries, I think we've all touched on this point. It is one of the most important things for me, is to remembering birthdays and anniversaries. So whether you have this within your HR team, or whether this is a line manager thing, they have a little note somewhere that there might be a birthday coming up of a loved one that's died, whether that be an employee or a colleague, and anniversaries as well of the actual day that they did die. One of the other things that is available is something called Grief in a Cuppa, which is a community support group, which you can have within your office. This offers a safe place for anyone that has been bereaved within your workplace, a time to speak and reflect about a loved one. But it's also quite a good space for somebody that may be supporting a friend or a colleague that might be bereaved. For more information about that, you can just drop me a message and I can point you in the right direction for that. One of the things that we've all said is, remember, everyone grieves differently. There is no right way, there is no wrong way, it's just your way. Some people do need to return to work, but in time they may need time to grieve. So I've spoken to a lot of people over the years that actually they wanted to throw themselves into work. They didn't want to focus on anything else. They just had to keep busy. But it doesn't matter how long it takes, whether it's 6 days, 6 weeks, 6 months, or even 60 years. Grief is grief, and it will come, and eventually, eventually it will be there. Grief is not a psychological disorder, even though it may feel like it at times. Grief doesn't just go away, it doesn't heal all wounds. And I suppose the utmost thing that I want to tell everybody is to be compassionate. Be a heart with ears, listen, but be compassionate. Could I have the next slide, please? So as I mentioned earlier on, we have mental health first aiders. I think we should have a grief first aider, somebody that is specialised at supporting and dealing with grief. We need grief first aiders who specialise in supporting an employee who has been bereaved. But this can also divorce, loss of home, loss of friendship, or any other significant emotional loss. So having somebody that has that can specialise and support somebody that is experiencing grief. There can be training that can be offered for that as well. We have mental health first aid and we think about all the other things, but I think if we had something specifically for grief, that might make companies to sort of give it an area. Where do I go to? Well, I've got a grief first aider, and they specialise in bereavement. And so remember, be a heart with ears. Having the correct procedures in place beforehand will ensure you are ready. Offer training and have a quiet place to talk. But just listen, be there, be available. And I think if you put all this money into training somebody, why not give them a little bit more time and compassion, and you'll get somebody back in the workforce that will be there again to start up again. But there might be times where they need that moment and that space to grieve. But why would you pump all that money into training somebody and not give them compassion and understanding to come back to work and readjust to their new normal? I think in the long run, it would save you money. And I think that's the next one. It might be the last one, I'm not sure. That's it. Thank you very much for listening. If there's any questions, and please do ask in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Lucy. Really great presentation. I'm going to come to questions. We've got quite a few that have come in. I'm going to ask firstly so just kind of group a few. So we have had a few about mental health first aiding, about the fact that actually it doesn't cover, bereavement is not covered in that training. Kirsty, could you maybe share a little bit more about how organisations could and should support any mental health first aiders to deal with bereavement? And then Lucy, I'm going to come to you to ask a little bit more about the concept of grief first aid training.
Yeah, we are obviously growing along with this, and we have seen in the recent months a few companies who are on the front foot, with their mental health first aiders, or booking our training grief and loss and bereavement awareness as an add-on, as almost like a CPD module for their first aiders. Usually we're taking a view very much of them being a safe place, and just very much as Lucy described, sort of holding them safely. We would never, training somebody to become a fully fledged bereavement counsellor of the Cruse style takes a lot of time commitment, and that's something that I think as yet organisations aren't quite ready for. Maybe in time that's something that will evolve. But even people so we're doing webinar training at the moment, having a couple of hour webinar to help people understand what grief is, what grief isn't, to expand a lot on what we've said here, to cover supportive conversations, which as mental health first aiders they're already should be hopefully pretty adept at, but then making sure turning that to case studies around somebody coming to say I'm feeling awful because of ... and the ... involves a bereavement. That's something we are doing, but not consistently, and it's something that's possibly worth considering in an organisation as a next step if you already have mental health first aiders.
Thank you. And Lucy, just to ask you to kind of expand a little bit on your concept there. Somebody's asked, are there any providers you know of that offer that training, and how does it link with the mental health?
I am that provider. It was an initiative that I came up with, being a grief first aider. So if anyone wants to find out a bit more information about it, then by all means give me a shout. But I do have a team of people that are growing to ensure that companies have this in place. But a bit like with everything else, you have mental health side of things. And I just think calling it the grief first aider gave it that title that people would understand, because we don't like to think that it's when you're grieving that it's a mental health thing, that it is, although there are lots of concepts that happen from grief. But having a grief first aider in place could point you in the right direction for who you need to speak to, what to do, what to say, what not to do. So if a company had that in place, then they'd know that they would just talk them through the steps of where they need to go. So yes, so I can offer that training for yourselves.
What's your website, Lucy?
Say it again.
What's your website if people want to get in touch?
Sorry, I think the information is all on these slides here, but it's also in the CIPD brochure. That's the word I was looking for, the brochure. But by all means, I said yes. Grief first aiders is what we need.
I think Lucy will agree with the thought that where mental health first aid has come on a massive journey over the last 5 to 10 years, grief, loss and bereavement is probably where mental health was back 5-10 years ago. We're only now really, it's starting to get talked about, and that hopefully that will continue.
And Claire, have you got any advice on, as a kind of got a few questions as an HR professional, how you can kind of upskill yourself in this area, particularly if you're trying to provide support, and what that might do to your own well-being as well?
Yeah, and we have some guidance that we've done with Mind, People Managers Guidance to Mental Health. So I'd really recommend that people take a look at that, whether they're in HR, whether they're a line manager, because I think that would be really helpful. And I think, providing good work for people, ensuring good people management practices after bereavement is really helpful. It also might be appropriate to carry out stress audits to highlight any risks to psychological health, and training line managers around, making sure that people have realistic workloads, that they're offering flexibility, are all things that are really helpful. And also training line managers around spotting the early warning signs of stress or distress following a bereavement, I think would be incredibly helpful.
Thank you. I've got a question. Are there any specific themes of needs coming from COVID-19 different from other causes of death? I mean, Kirsty, can I ask you that first? Is that coming through in the kind of helplines? Does it require a slightly different approach at all? To unmute yourself.
I'm not. The last stats I heard from our helpline was actually COVID-19 deaths is the third most common called up about. Currently, it's still cancer and heart, followed by COVID. I think we're still learning. I think we are still adapting. We know so much more as an organisation than we did back at the beginning. I think the fact that when somebody sadly does die with COVID, there is a good few weeks from being admitted to hospital to ultimately, sadly, any death is something we didn't understand at the beginning. So I suppose I'm not the best clinical person, if I'm really honest, and I think we are still working and we're still researching on that. But we're also still very mindful of all the other bereavements and all the other losses and all the other deaths that have happened in this time that have also been impacted by the restrictions. And I think actually at Cruse, the cause of death isn't really where we focus. It's the emotional impact and the ripples, and how people are able to get the support. And I think people have been massively impacted by not being able to meet with loved ones, talk with loved ones, and that's the same whether somebody has died with cancer or whether somebody has died with COVID. So I think we're looking for what's more alike than different. I feel I've wuttered a bit, but I think we're saying, I think there's definitely a sense that COVID is taking the limelight, and we shouldn't forget all the wider losses at this time.
And Lucy, any kind of anecdotal data from you on the impact of the current situation? And it could be the cause of death, or it could be maybe the social isolation.
Exactly, as grief is grief, whether, like Kirsty said, you've died of a heart attack or cancer or COVID. I think the only difference now is that we're all having to do things slightly differently. So you can't necessarily be with your loved one when they've died, so that's going to have an impact on how you grieve. Because it's and the fact that the funerals, you can't have as many people there to say goodbye. I think there is something. I was talking to a friend, a colleague, and I said to her, it's as though the tsunami of grief is waiting to come. And I said, I don't think we're not going to be aware of actually the impact of what coronavirus has had on people's health, their mental health, their grief, everything, all sorts of that. This is going to be 12 months, 2 years down the line, or however long we stay in lockdown for. But there is a tsunami of grief waiting to come. And it's going to overwhelm everybody. And hopefully having a bereavement policy in place and having all these support initiatives in place beforehand, and being prepared for your business of the people that have been bereaved and how the grievers are going to be.
And Claire, have you got any tips on how to deal with this as a people professional, given that you are probably working from home and everybody's working, a lot of the people that you're working with are working from home? You haven't got that place.
Yeah, I think that the role of the line manager becomes ever more important. If people are coming back into the physical workspace, you might be able to pick up on some of the signs, but actually working remotely, it becomes more difficult. So it's so important to get those regular, deliberate one-to-one conversations in place. Making sure that you are talking to bereaved employees, that you're finding out about their personal circumstances, that you're supporting them, as much as you possibly can. And as we've said, because of the pandemic, people will be juggling, all sorts of other issues that we don't even know about potentially. They might have caring responsibilities for older people, which are more challenging in the pandemic. There'll be lots of different things. So important to have those supportive conversations, and also to make adjustments to support them as much as possible.
Thank you. Kirsty, somebody specifically asked about Cruse's bereavement social groups. I don't know if that's something you can talk about to support isolation post-bereavement.
Yeah, we always have offered group support. It is very variable depending, because of how Cruse is very local, national and local. We, if I'm honest, don't have consistent support across the country. It's very much driven by the volunteer population within an area. So if you ever look online, you'll see different branches. There are sort of on the ground volunteers. They would certainly in the past have run group work, and we're certainly moving back to bereavement support groups and other social groups. Obviously at the moment they can't happen. So I would say look at where you are located, and in time that's where the areas will be. I know they were getting going with walking groups until the rules changed. So it's certainly something we've done, but I can't say it is consistently available. There was also a question about loss of a home on the chat. Just to touch on that, we specifically call our training loss and bereavement awareness. Bereavement is obviously the ultimate loss, but the training, we talk about various models and theories to help support people with loss and bereavement, and they are as equally as applicable to family breakup, divorce, well, that is family breakup, loss of home and other losses, but we obviously put it in the context and through the filter of bereavement, but it's applicable.
you. I think this question is probably for somebody who works in the healthcare sector or social care. Have you got any thoughts about how to support frontline staff who are talking to bereaved relatives of patients? Lucy, any thoughts on that?
Similar sort of thing. So as I said, I mentioned I'm a grief recovery specialist, so I am certified by Grief UK to be able to help and support people through all different types of loss. A bit earlier on you were saying about mentioning about home loss, financial loss, divorce, all sorts of things like that. Contact either Grief UK or another support organisation to give you the training to be able to support them in the future.
Yeah. And Claire, any thoughts on supporting frontline staff who are dealing with grief kind of adjacently, I guess?
I think it will be following lots of the steps that we've outlined today. Frontline staff will be under immense pressure, so coping with their own, with the associated impact upon them, is really important. In our guidance, we have some links to some NHS bereavement support documents, which I think are really helpful and quite specialist. So I'd probably direct people to take a look at the guidance and go through to those links specifically.
Thank you. And we did have a question earlier, which I've lost, but somebody was asking about any advice on, if you have been bereaved, how to kind of raise it and address it with your line manager or with HR. Kirsty, if you're coming at it from that side.
If you are the bereaved person, you know what you need if you're the bereaved person, and we would all like to think your line manager would be human about it. If you don't feel they're human, the right person, find the right person in your organisation who will be. It's all about people, it's all about relationships. There isn't a formula, and it's really hard to give anything very, very specific, but you if you're bereaved will know. It's hard to speak up, but once you're over that hurdle, hopefully that will put you in the best position to pull on the sources of support. But I understand it's difficult.
Thank you. And Lucy, anything from your experience to add for that, how you kind of raise it if you are that staff member?
Just mirroring really what Kirsty's just said. There's not a lot of things I would do any differently.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to draw it to a close there, because I think I've taken most of the questions. And I see Lucy's been putting some links in the comments and chats as well. As I said earlier, the slides are going to be available to download, because loads of really, really useful resources that I think that a lot of people watching would find incredibly helpful. Thank you so much to Claire, Kirsty and Lucy for joining us this afternoon and for sharing your thoughts on this topic. Thank you for everybody watching. Thank you for your questions. I hope we answered most of those. I understand this is a really difficult topic on a personal level, but also for as people professionals as well. This has been such a tough year. So do remember the CIPD resources such as Wellbeing Helpline are there to support you in supporting your staff. But that is it from us for now. We'll be back with a webinar on vaccines, kind of how to deal with that in the workplace on the 11th of February. So hopefully we'll see you there. But have a good afternoon, and thanks very much for joining us. Bye for now.
Thank you.